and application of the double standards by such countries will more injure our already wounded common values and principles, will more damage credibility of Human Rights Council and UN, and will more tarnish global trust on the human rights machinery. We invite such countries to first pay attention to the human rights situation in their own countries that in some cases are troubling, and then prevent further politicization of human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. The DPRK delegation would like to exercise its right of reply to the allegations of some European EU countries, Japan and ROK. Their nonsensical allegations on the DPRK are arrogant and politically motivated for despicable purposes. Therefore, we categorically reject. It is an act of following the U.S. hostile policy towards the DPRK and has nothing to do with the genuine human rights. They should, above all, handle the human rights abuses in their countries rather than naming others. We deplore the brazen attempt by ROK to use this forum as a confrontational platform against the DPRK for its despicable purposes. The allegations by ROK have no connection with promotion and protection of genuine human rights. Its remarks are full of fabrications and distortions aimed for the political and military confrontation and plot against the DPRK. ROK continues to disregard the demands of the international community to remedy systematic and widespread violations and abuses of human rights. That is maintaining of national security law and other evil laws contrary to the international human rights laws. That is repression of democratic entities and individuals, the trade unions and mass media. That is increasing practice of social evil such as human trafficking for sexual exploitation and forced labor at home, as well as abduction of DPRK citizens abroad. The world's top suicide kingdom is none other than the ROK. We strongly urge ROK to take concrete steps to end its all sorts of human rights abuses, including those committed by outside forces, rather than playing as a servant of the United States. As attested by history, Japan is the war criminal state on worst record, which includes forcibly drafting more than 8.4 million Koreans, massacring over 1 million, and forcing 200,000 Korean women into sexual slaves for Imperial Japanese Army. We strongly urge Japan to take concrete measures to hold state responsibility through poignant remorse, sincere apology, and legal reparations for heinous crimes against humanity, rather than touting so-called abduction issue that had already been settled irreversibly and completely through our sincerity and efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Azerbaijan.
Mr. President, we exercise our right of reply to the statement by Armenia. Firstly, we remain concerned about the territorial claims to the Karabakh region, voiced in the statement of Armenia, which referred to the sovereign territories of Azerbaijan under a fake name. Secondly, Azerbaijan has taken concrete steps to investigate and prosecute mass atrocities and other offenses committed by Armenia during its aggression in the early 1990s and the subsequent occupation of the territories of Azerbaijan for almost 30 years. The denial and ignorance of serious violations, coupled with attempts to discredit and thereby obstruct justice through disinformation and smear campaigns, including in international bodies, constitute a clear contempt for international law and the rule of law. Today, as we commemorate the 33rd anniversary of the Khojaly genocide, we once again underline that accountability and redress are essential to ensure the rights of the victims and for post-conflict normalization and reconciliation. Thirdly, we reject deliberate misinterpretation of the legitimate demands of the Western Azerbaijan community to return to their ancestral lands in Armenia as a territorial claim by Azerbaijan. Despite repeated calls by the expelled Azerbaijanis to launch a genuine dialogue and ensure a safe and dignified return to their homeland, the government of Armenia persistently denies them exercising this fundamental right. We expect the High Commissioner and the relevant UN mechanisms to address the rights of hundreds of thousands of Azerbaijanis once expelled from their homes in Armenia. Finally, Azerbaijan has fully restored its territorial integrity and sovereignty and has been promoting a peace agenda in the region. Despite the wounds of the aggression, Azerbaijan offered Armenia peace on equal terms, fully in line with norms and principles of international law on the basis of mutual recognition of and respect for each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Over the past year, Azerbaijan and Armenia have registered significant progress in the normalization process. Azerbaijan will continue to take this process forward, acting with a strong sense of responsibility for not only its national security and well-being, but also for a better future for the entire region. Our commitment and determination to bring this process to its logical conclusion remain intact. We expect Armenia to eliminate the key barrier in the normalization process, which is to legally abandon territorial claims against Azerbaijan through the constitutional amendments. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Pakistan.
Mr. President, truth is inconvenient for some, and when facts beget truth, they become inconvenient as well. This delegation must realize that prevarications will not change the facts on ground, especially those established by the UN Security Council. The fact is that Jammu and Kashmir never was and never will be the so-called integral part of India. The fact is that India is an illegally occupying territory of the disputed territory. Time and again, this delegation resorts to the same tactics of deflecting global attention away from its violations and abuses committed in the occupied Jammu and Kashmir. While the reality remains that the Indian occupation forces are unabashedly resorting to massive human rights violations in the territory. Time and again, several UN mandate holders have raised alarm on the state of human rights in the occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Many of these experts have raised specific objections to the draconian laws being applied in the occupied territory, giving occupation forces powers that are not only inconsistent with international human rights law, but are an anathema to it. Mr. President, the continual denial of the Kashmiris' right to self-determination is a long-standing violation of the UN Charter, UNHRC resolutions, and the international law. Every human right of the occupied Kashmiris has been violated during this 7 decades-long inglorious history of the illegal occupation. If India wants to contest these facts, the first stage should be to provide access to OHCHR, international media, and independent observers to the occupied territory and allow them to determine facts on the ground. Lastly, Mr. President, silencing criticism is always convenient when facing the truth is inconvenient. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation would like to exercise the right of reply to the statement made by North Korea in this session. It is regrettable that unfounded statements have been made regarding history. Any nation in the region should be humble about its own history and must take it seriously. Japan has been diligently maintaining this stance, and Japan's progress as a peaceful nation after the war is a testament to this. Japan has consistently respected democracy and human rights and contributed to peace and prosperity in the Asia-Pacific region and the international community for 80 years since the end of World War II. Referring to comfort women as sexual slavery does not reflect the facts, and therefore this expression should not be used. The claim and figures that North Korea mentioned regarding Japan are groundless and based on factual errors. The claims North Korea on the issue of abductions are based on erroneous recognition. The families of the victims are now well advanced in age, and some of them have passed away. There is no time to lose before we resolve the abduction issue. Japan strongly urges North Korea to return all the abductees to their homes immediately. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation would like to exercise the right of reply to the statements of the North Korean delegation. We will not respond to each and every groundless accusation directed at my government. Rather than making these baseless accusations against my government,
Sorry, continue, please. Sorry.
Okay. My delegation would like to exercise the right of reply to the statements of the North Korean delegation. We will not respond to each and every groundless accusations directed at my government. Rather than making these baseless accusations against my government, the DPRK should heed the voices of the international community, which continue to raise serious concerns over the systematic, grave, and widespread human rights violations, including crimes against humanity committed in North Korea. When it comes to the North Korean defectors mentioned by the DPRK delegation in its statement, they decided to come to the Republic of Korea of their own free will. They have settled down in the Republic of Korea and are currently living in the country as ordinary citizens. Meanwhile, the issues of abductees, detainees, and unrepatriated prisoners of war have persisted for 4 decades. We urge the DPRK to immediately verify their whereabouts and return them to their families. According to our relevant laws, the number of wartime abductees officially recognized stands at 4,777, while there are 516 post-war abductees. Additionally, testimonies from repatriated POWs indicated that hundreds of South Korean POWs remain unreturned. Furthermore, 6 of our nationals are still being held in North Korea. In particular, 3 missionaries, Kim Jong-woo, Kim Guk-gi, and Choi Chung-gil, whom my vice minister mentioned in her statement yesterday, have been detained for over a decade. Mr. President, we'd like to reaffirm that the Korean government, under its commitment to human rights as a universal value, remains fully committed to supporting and actively contributing to the UN and international efforts to improve the human rights situation in North Korea. The Korean government will continue to pursue multidimensional efforts to promote human rights of our fellow North Koreans. I thank you.
Thank you. I understand that the distinguished representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea has asked to exercise his right, a second right of reply. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation would like to exercise its second right of reply to the allegations by Japan and ROK. In the history of World War, Japan is an only criminal state that horribly violated the dignity and fundamental rights of hundreds of thousands of women, including teenage girls, to the battlefields as sexual slaves. There is only one country in the world which organized and managed the sexual slavery system by means of state power, and has persistently denied such crimes against humanity without any investigation and punishment for over 80 years. It is none other than Japan. Japan can never evade its historical and legal moral responsibility for its crimes by whatsoever. ROK continues to disregard the demands of the international community to remedy systematic and widespread violations and abuses of human rights. It's ridiculous that ROK, that has never been able to protest all the humiliations and human rights abuses imposed on her people by the US military, the occupying force over the past half-century, dares to talk about somebody's fabricated human rights issues. We urge ROK to focus intensively on strong remedial action of its dire human rights plight as per recommendations by the international community. For us, the sophism of ROK against the DPRK can only be heard as the size of those who are cornered by the inferiority in all areas of political and social life. Thank you.
I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Japan. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation would like to exercise the second right to reply to the statement made by North Korea. My delegation will not repeat here what we already said, but we have to say again that the claims and figures that North Korea mentioned regarding Japan are groundless and based on the factual errors. Having humbly accepted the facts of history, Japan has sincerely addressed various issues for almost 80 years since the end of World War II. In this way, Japan has been actively contributing to international peace and security. Again, referring to comfort women, word sexual slavery does not reflect the facts, and therefore this expression should not be used. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is regrettable that we are compelled to exercise a second right of reply to the statements of the North Korean delegation. I will not repeat the points already made in my previous statement. In June last year, the UN Security Council, with overwhelming support from its members, convened a meeting on the DPRK's human rights situation, highlighting how the DPRK regime has sacrificed the welfare of its people to sustain in its illegal nuclear and missile development. We are particularly concerned that the DPRK funds its illegal weapons programs through severe human rights violations, including forced labor. Furthermore, the deepening military cooperation between Russia and the DPRK has once again underscored the strong linkage between the DPRK's human rights violations and international peace and security. Testimonies from captured North Korean soldiers reveal that they are deployed to the battlefield without knowledge of their actual combat environment and are indoctrinated to commit suicide rather than be captured, depriving them of their right of life. Ultimately, such deployments rooted in human rights abuses only perpetuate the vicious cycle of nuclear and missile development. Mr. President, during the fourth cycle of the UPR on the DPRK in November last year, numerous states voiced serious concerns over the country's human rights violations. We strongly urge the DPRK to take these recommendations seriously and implement concrete measures to address them. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Armenia.
President, we feel compelled to take the floor for the second time in order to reject attempts to distort the facts and evade responsibilities by Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan's state-sponsored policy of Armenophobia and ethnic hatred is documented by UNHRC, which has raised alarm over Azerbaijan's failure to combat deep-rooted anti-Armenian sentiment at the highest level of the government. The ICJ, in its provisional order of December 7, 2021, ordered Azerbaijan to take all necessary measures to prevent and punish acts of racial hatred and violence against Armenians. Yet today, this harmful ideology continues and has even reached an alarming levels, as evidenced by the recent statements of President Ilham Aliyev. In his recent bellicose, the President of Azerbaijan referred to Armenia as a fascist state formed by the proponents of fascist ideology, which must be eradicated either by the Armenian leadership will destroy it or we will. We have no other choice. These statements of Azerbaijan are being increasingly echoed in so-called Western Azerbaijan narrative, which is sponsored by the top leadership of Azerbaijan, implying to 60% of the sovereign territory of the Republic of Armenia, which is referred to as territory presently under the control of the political and legal unit called Republic of Armenia. If combined with Azerbaijan's multi-million-dollar procurement of weapons, this rhetoric reveals a growing and deliberate threat emanating from Azerbaijan against Armenia. Azerbaijan's state policy of hatred against Armenia is manifested also in systematic destruction of Armenian cultural heritage in Nagorno-Karabakh. Armenian churches, monasteries, cemeteries, and historical landmarks are being destroyed and razed or misrepresented to eradicate their identity. The SR on cultural rights called it cultural cleansing.
Chers collègues.
Your Excellencies, dear colleagues, given that it is always necessary to remind speakers that they have to use language which is commensurate with the inherent dignity which is proper for a dialogue on human rights. I very much hope for your cooperation to make sure that our discussion can be conducted with the respect that it merits. Everyone can express their point of view, but it must remain or be spoken in a respectful way. Tolerance must be one of the hallmarks of this Human Rights Council. It is with this in mind that if there are no further requests for the floor, I will now close the high-level segment and the general segment of the 58th session of this council. Your Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, before we continue, we need to tackle issues relating to procedure and the organisation of the meeting. I wish to remind you that during the organisational meeting of the 3rd of February, we considered the programme of work of the 58th session of the Human Rights Council, and a revised version of the programme of work dating 25 February was circulated yesterday. I'm convinced that the programme of work can be approved unamended because it is an evolving document and that changes can be made throughout this session. If I see no objection, I declare that the programme of work of the 58th session of the Human Rights Council stands adopted. Your Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, allow me to remind you that the online registration system for the speakers list for interactive dialogues, the general debates and the interactive dialogues opened on the 17th of February. The speakers list will be closed about 15 minutes after the beginning of each debate, dialogue or interactive dialogue. The online registration on the speakers list for the adoption of the outcome documents of the UPR will be open from Monday 10 March at 9 a.m. to Thursday 13 March at 6 p.m. and no registration will be possible after this date. Speaking times or modalities for determining speaking times will be the same as the recent sessions, and speakers lists will be available on the extranet of the Council and will be regularly updated for each debate. Allow me to remind you that the deadline or limit for the submission of draft resolutions has been set at Friday, 21st of March at 1 p.m. It is only in exceptional circumstances that the Council will be able to extend this deadline by a maximum of 24 hours. And I seize this opportunity to remind you that the late submission of drafts resolutions, as well as the high number of oral and written revisions or amendments will complicate the task of many delegations, and late submission of drafts will prevent the Secretariat and make it difficult for conference services to ensure the translation of texts in all languages, and will make it difficult to produce programme budget implications. Let me also remind you that in order to facilitate the work and the performance of interpreters, delegations are requested to provide a copy of their statements in advance by uploading them on the online system and by providing a paper copy to conference services. And finally, delegations are asked to upload an electronic or digital version of their statements via the online registration system for the speakers list so that they can be posted on the extranet of the Council. It's essential to upload these speeches in Word format in order to improve access to Council proceedings for persons with disabilities. And those that are uploaded in a non-accessible format will not be posted on the extranet. Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I wish to emphasize that the United Nations, including this Council, have zero tolerance for any form of harassment, including sexual harassment. All complaints will swiftly be dealt with, and we would encourage the reporting of any incident directly to a United Nations security official. Your Excellency, distinguished colleagues, we are awaiting the High Commissioner so that he can present his report on the occupied Palestinian territories, and we will therefore reconvene at 5 p.m. and I ask your forbearance for this short delay.
Excellence.
Excellencies, colleagues. I now declare open agenda item 2, entitled the Annual Report by the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and reports of the High Commissioner and the Secretary General. We will now begin the interactive dialogue on the report by the High Commissioner on the situation of human rights in the occupied Palestinian territories, including East Jerusalem, in accordance with Resolution 55/28. I have the pleasure of welcoming Mr. Volker Türk, High Commissioner for Human Rights, to introduce his report. The list of speakers will be closed in 15 minutes. High Commissioner, you have the floor.
Monsieur,
Thank you, President.
we are at an inflection point in the crisis in the occupied Palestinian territory. A fragile ceasefire is allowing the people of Gaza to breathe, Israeli hostages and Palestinian detainees to be released, and life-saving humanitarian aid to be delivered. At this tenuous moment, the world must ask itself how to resolve this decades-old conflict and stop the cycle of violence. Any plans for a better future must deal with the past, so accountability and justice for violations are crucial. For more than 57 years, people in Gaza and in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, have been suffocating under Israeli occupation. They have been denied their most basic human rights, from the right to self-determination, to freedom of movement, to an adequate standard of living. In Gaza, they have been subjected to blockades amounting to collective punishment. In the West Bank, illegal settlements and violence have been growing for decades, in violation of international law, with a significant increase over the past 3 years. Most of these violations have gone unpunished. There's absolutely no justification for the horrific attacks committed on 7 October 2023, when Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups brutally assaulted Israeli communities, killed civilians, and took more than 250 hostages, and I have repeatedly condemned these acts. And nothing justifies the appalling manner in which Israel has conducted its military operations in Gaza, which consistently breached fundamental principles of international humanitarian law. According to the Gaza Ministry of Health, more than 48,000 people, most of whom are women and children, have been killed. Over 35,000 children have lost one or both parents. More than 1,054 medical personnel have been killed, with many others injured or detained by Israeli forces. At least 277 United Nations staff have been killed, as well as a reported 200 journalists and media workers. Over 2/3 of essential infrastructure is destroyed or damaged. The level of devastation to basic features of civilian life across Gaza is massive, from homes to hospitals to schools to the justice system. Restrictions imposed by Israel, despite its obligations as occupying power, have created a humanitarian catastrophe. And an estimated 90% of the population has been displaced, often multiple times. In the West Bank, Israel has ramped up its use of unnecessary and disproportionate force against Palestinians, has destroyed refugee camps, severely restricted movement, and displaced tens of thousands of people. In the northern West Bank, many are now in need of urgent humanitarian assistance. Torture and ill treatment of detainees has been a continuing and appalling feature on all sides. The severe crackdown on civic space, affecting in particular those working on human rights and humanitarian issues through threats, intimidation, and other measures, is alarming. Behind each awful statistic is a life lost, torn apart, or shattered. We cannot yet grasp the full extent of this tragedy, nor the many years of trauma, grief, and mourning that lie ahead. Mr. President, the report before you today take stock of the raft of international human rights violations in the occupied Palestinian territory and the absence of meaningful accountability for them. There has been an unprecedented disregard for the principles of international humanitarian law in the conduct of hostilities in Gaza and Israel since October 2023. As just detailed, and as my office and others have documented, Israel's means and methods of warfare have caused staggering levels of casualties and destruction, raising concerns over the commission of war crimes and other possible atrocity crimes. There has been a limited number of investigations and indictments by the Israeli authorities, for example, for abuse of detainees. However, there are serious doubts about the capacity and will of the Israeli justice system to deliver full accountability in line with international standards, notably in relation to the unlawful killing of Palestinians in Gaza or in the West Bank. Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups have taken, held, and tortured hostages in Gaza and here have indiscriminately fired projectiles into Israeli territory, amounting to war crimes. There are grave concerns that they may have committed other serious breaches of international humanitarian law in Gaza, including the intentional co-location of military objectives and Palestinian civilians. My office is unaware of any measures taken by Hamas and other Palestinian groups to punish those responsible for all violations. Mr. President, any attempts at shaping a peaceful future where such horrors do not recur must ensure that perpetrators are held to account. The tragic record of this conflict and of so many other conflicts shows clearly how impunity begets more violence. Abuse is given free rein to ripple across other war zones. This harms us all and generations down the line. Delegitimizing and threatening international institutions that are there to serve people and uphold international law also harms us all. It is clear that all these violations and abuses need to be investigated independently. Excellencies, we urgently need an end to the conflict, the unconditional release, freeing of all hostages, the release of arbitrarily held detainees, and an end as rapidly as possible to Israel's unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory as affirmed by the International Court of Justice. The ceasefire must hold. Each phase must be implemented by both sides in good faith and in full. And all of us must do everything in our power to build on it, to create a path to a sustainable peace so that Palestinians and Israelis can live side by side in equal dignity and rights. And it should be for the Palestinian people to determine their own future. We must resist any normalization of unlawful conduct, including proposals for annexation or forced transfer, which could threaten the peace and security of Palestinians and Israelis and of the wider region. This is the moment for voices of reason to prevail, for solutions that will deliver justice and make space for compassion, healing, and truth-telling. This begins by seeing the pain and suffering of the other, and we have seen, unfortunately, so much dehumanizing rhetoric, including by political leaders. Defending and maintaining the international edifice of human rights and the law is everyone's responsibility. The alternative is unthinkable for Israelis, Palestinians, and for our common humanity. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. In accordance with our practice, we will now begin by hearing the delegations of the countries concerned. I see that the delegation of Israel is not in the room, so I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the State of Palestine. You have 5 minutes. Microphone.
Thank you, President. At the outset, I wish to thank the High Commissioner and his office for the report and for the valuable presentation of it to the Council. We should, however, reiterate that it has not been balanced in dealing with the facts, because it deals with Israeli settler occupation and colonial occupation with the Palestinian state, which lives under it on equal footing, ignoring that it's illegal. The occupation of practices apartheid in line with legal and UN reports. The report outlines some of the grave violations committed by the occupation forces up until 24 October. But the situation on the ground is more atrocious. Since 77 October until now, the occupation force committed war crimes and genocide against the Palestinians, leading to the killing of thousands of Palestinians, including 15,000 children and 12,000 women. The occupation forces targeted the medical crews and journalists, killing 186 medics and more journalists, together with 203 UN staff. More than 11,200 Palestinians unaccounted for under debris of demolished houses, and over 9,000 Palestinians are behind bars under occupation, facing violations including torture, misuse, and medical neglect. President, in spite of the ceasefire in 18 February of this year, Israel was not committed to it from the first day. Occupation forces killed 132 Palestinians during the truce and injured 900 in immediate target of civilians returning to their homes and who want to remove the debris. However, we see some sides lately calling for the displacement of Gazans and refusing their return, which is in grave violation against humanity and a war crime in line with Roma Pact. The occupying power uses hunger as a weapon of war, ignoring the ICJ orders, which compels it to allow entry of humanitarian aid. Two-thirds of needed trucks have been allowed in, and tents have been denied, together with mobile homes, in spite of need to have them, in addition of a denial of entry of heavy equipment to remove debris. It has impeded access of food, medics, and slowing the work of hospitals, which has been destroyed by Israeli shelling. President, the occupying power forces and the settlers have escalated their terror campaign in the West Bank through executions, collective detention, demolition of houses, and methodic ethnic cleansing in Jenin, Nablus, Tulkarm, and Topaz, and other cities and villages and refugee camps in Palestine. This led to displacement of over 40,000 Palestinians. Demolition activities of infrastructure and houses is ongoing and unabated in the West Bank. The Minister of the Occupation Army said it bluntly that, and I quote, people will not return to the north of West Bank camps, and that they have stopped the work of UNRWA, which is an avowal of methodic policies of displacement. The aim is to put an end to UNRWA, and in order to put an end to Palestinian refugees, putting an end to the right of return. President, wars have rules, as Secretary General said. However, the illegal occupation power committed all types of crimes, including genocides, hunger, prevented water, electricity, and medicine, denied access of assistance, transfer of the sick. It targeted hospitals, places of worship, and schools. All of these are violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law and Roma Pact. This means that legal international institutions should shoulder their responsibilities in order to provide protection to our people and to hold the perpetrators and killers to account. We welcome arrest warrants against Netanyahu and his Minister of Defense. The president interrupts the speaker.
Thank you very much. I now open the floor for questions and comments on the report. The speaking time is 1 minute and 30 seconds. The speaking list is now closed, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Jordan on behalf of the group of Arab states.
In the name of Allah, the most gracious, most graceful, our group took note of the report and wished to express its concerns vis-à-vis its chronicling of events. It showed that there is a correspondence between Israel and the Palestinians and the occupation. This is a fact denied by the report, despite that it has mentioned the ICG's advisory opinion. Palestinians are under occupation, and the genocide cannot be described as mere escalation without recognizing decades of siege and settlement. We condemn Israel's non-cooperation with the OHCHR and call upon the international community to pressure Israel to allow the Commission of Inquiry to conduct its mandate in investigating violations of international law. In closing, our group stresses the need to combat impunity and call upon the international community and parties to Geneva 4 to shoulder their responsibilities and take all necessary measures to ensure accountability, provide redress, and ensure Palestinians access to their rights and end to the Israeli illegal occupation. And thank you, President.
The floor to the distinguished representative of Kuwait on behalf of the Cooperation Council for the Arab States of the Gulf.
Thank you, President. Our countries took note of the report on the situation of human rights in the occupied Palestinian territories. We condemn the escalation of violations against the Palestinians by the occupying power. This occupying power, which violates international law and principles of human rights in Gaza Strip. We have seen the most heinous crimes against civilians over a year and a half. This included denying entry of assistance, destroying facilities, and ending the work of UNRWA. In this light, we applaud the efforts by Egypt and Qatar and the US in order to reach a ceasefire and exchange of prisoners, and we call for entry of assistance without impediment in order to reach a permanent ceasefire. In the West Bank, the occupation conducts large-scale attacks and conducts a collective punishment with disregard of the death of civilians and in violation of international law. In closing, we see that the two-state solution ensures stability and peace and call for doubling diplomatic efforts to find a comprehensive and just law that guarantees the rights of Palestinians to have their own independent state in 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. And thank you, President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union. Microphone, please.
Thank you, President. We reiterate our support to your mandate. We support your call to pursue independent investigation, accountability and justice for any grave violations and abuses as stated in your report, High Commissioner. The EU has warmly welcomed the ceasefire agreement in Gaza. It is vital that the deal is fully implemented. The EU recalls the need to fully implement the ICJ orders, which are legally binding. While welcoming the increase of aid entering Gaza since the ceasefire, the EU reiterates its calls for access to humanitarian aid and that aid can be effectively distributed, including by UN agencies and notably UNRWA. The EU reiterates its condemnation in the strongest term of the terrorist attacks conducted by Hamas against Israel on 7th October. In exercising its right to defend itself, Israel must fully comply with its obligation under international law. The EU strongly condemns the further escalation in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. The EU reiterates its call on Israel to cooperate fully with the UN, including human rights mechanisms. The EU will remain committed to a comprehensive, just and lasting peace based on the two-state solution. The EU underlines the vital role of civil society and hopes that cooperation with civil society will remain unhampered. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ghana on behalf of the Group of African States.
Mr. President, I have the honor to deliver the statement on behalf of the African Group. The full version will be posted on the extranet. The African Group extends its appreciation to the High Commissioner for this report. The group remains deeply concerned about the persistent lack of accountability for the violations committed against the Palestinian people and its exacerbation in light of the unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe caused by brutal Israeli aggression in Gaza, as well as escalation of violations committed by Israeli forces in the West Bank. Stemming from its common values and principles that stand strongly against colonialism, oppression, and apartheid, the African Group reaffirms the centrality of the just cause of Palestinians and steadfastness of its support to the historic struggle of the Palestinian people to realize their rights to self-determination and establish their independent state based on the 4th of June 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. The African Group calls on Israel to fully comply with the provisional order issued by the International Court of Justice and reiterates its unflinching support for relevant UJA resolutions on Palestine and declared positions of the UN Secretary General on the ongoing atrocities committed in Gaza despite the recently assigned ceasefire agreement, which can inevitably lead to serious repercussions on the state of peace and security in the Middle East. The African Group underscores the necessity of resolving the Palestinian...
I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Pakistan on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation.
Thank you, Mr. President. The OIC Group thanks the High Commissioner for the presentation and takes note of the report prepared by his office. We have just heard from the state of Palestine and stand with the Palestinian people in complete solidarity and unwavering support. Events before, during, and after the reporting period have laid bare the illegal occupying power's utter disregard for its human rights and humanitarian obligations. Attempts to strike a balance can only favor the occupying power. We must therefore guard against false equivalence between the occupying power and those under its illegal occupation. The OIC Group condemns in the strongest terms Israel's horrific and shocking crimes in the Gaza Strip in the context of the crime of genocide. We categorically reject the forced displacement of Palestinian citizens inside or outside their land and call for the withdrawal of occupation forces from the entirety of Gaza. Mr. President, no pretext can ever justify what the Palestinian people have suffered and continue to suffer in Gaza, East Jerusalem, or the West Bank. No category of protections has been left unviolated. The OIC Group calls for credible steps to prevent the obliteration of evidence and to hold the perpetrators accountable. We also call for immediate and effective steps to bring an end to the illegal occupation of Palestine consistent with the ICJ advisory opinion of 19 July 2024. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Saudi Arabia.
Thank you, President. My delegation has examined the report of the High Commissioner about the human rights situation in the occupied Palestinian territories. In this regard, we reiterate our categorical rejection to any impingement on the rights of the Palestinian people, whether through settler Israeli policies or by annexation or efforts to displace the brotherly people of Palestine. We reiterate our commitment to the Palestinian people and its right to establish an independent Palestinian state on 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital, and would like to further mobilize the international community in favor of the rights of the Palestinian people in line with the UN General Assembly resolutions. The Kingdom will continue to stand by the side of the brotherly people of Palestine, whether through diplomatic offices or through the provision of humanitarian aid. And in conclusion, we reiterate that there is no sustainable and fair peace without the Palestinian people receiving all of their legitimate rights based on the international framework of legitimacy. Thank you, President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kuwait.
Shukran, Sayyid Rais. Thank you, President. My delegation would like to associate itself with the statements delivered by the groups it belongs to, and we have taken note of the report presented by the High Commissioner. Mr. President, there are no words that will faithfully depict what is going on in the occupied Palestinian territories in light of the crimes and abuses by the occupying power and the flagrant abuses to international humanitarian law and the UN Charter. We are before a moral and human responsibility before the Palestinian people. After a year of war in Gaza, while we were hoping for an end to the bloodshed and an end to the operations of the occupying powers military, we're witnessing threats to evict the Palestinian people from Gaza and the West Bank and refusing the return of the refugees and continuing to target assets and infrastructure. We call upon the international community to shoulder its responsibility in favor of the Palestinian people, and we reiterate our principled stance in favor of an independent Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital on the borders of the 4th of June 1967, based on international legitimacy and the Arab Peace Initiative. Thank you, President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Canada.
Thank you, High Commissioner, for your update. Canada fully supports the ceasefire in Gaza. Parties must negotiate subsequent phases with the purpose of ending hostilities permanently. There has been unbearable suffering and loss over the past 15 months, precipitated by Hamas's terrorist attacks on October 7th, 2023. We condemn these attacks and call for the release of all remaining hostages. Civilians, particularly women, children, journalists, humanitarian and health workers, have borne the brunt of this conflict. More than 47,000 people have been killed, alongside mass displacement, the collapse of basic services, including access to food, water, and medicine, and the destruction of civilian infrastructure. Israel must allow immediate, unimpeded access for humanitarian assistance. All parties should refrain from actions that put at risk the safety of civilians and must refrain from unlawful attacks on civilian objects, such as medical facilities and schools. There must be credible investigations into all allegations of human rights violation, including of sexual and gender-based violence in Israel and in the occupied Palestinian territories. Accountability is essential. Impunity is unacceptable. Canada remains committed to a two-state solution where Israelis and Palestinians can live side by side in peace and security. Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole.
Thank you. I call on the distinguished representative of Switzerland. President, Switzerland thanks the High Commissioner for his report. Switzerland is alarmed by recent images of the handover of the bodies of Israeli hostages and explosions in Bat Yam, and by the ongoing intensification of military operations in the West Bank. Switzerland calls for the full implementation of the 15th of January agreement with a view to putting an end to this devastating war despite recent events. The Israeli occupation that has been ongoing since 1967 is illegal, as noted by the International Court of Justice, and it must cease. Transfer of populations is forbidden by international humanitarian law. Switzerland is deeply concerned by escalating violence in the West Bank, including in East Jerusalem, which is causing numerous victims, and also the massive destruction of infrastructure and major population displacement. At the same time, attacks, threats, and intimidations by settlers are worsening the situation. Switzerland firmly condemns human rights violations of international humanitarian law and human rights committed by all sides. We call for everyone to abide by their obligations and international law. Accountability and the fight against impunity are crucial for victims and for sustainable peace. Independent investigations should be carried out into all allegations of violations so that the perpetrators are brought to justice. Only a two-state solution with Israel and Palestine, of which Gaza is an integral part, can succeed.
Jordan.
President, I'd like to thank the High Commissioner for his briefing, and I call upon him to continue his efforts based on his mandate. The advisory opinion that we've heard from the ICJ was clear from last year. The Israeli occupation in the occupied Palestinian territory is illegitimate. As is evidenced in the report that we've just heard, there are abuses and crimes that have been perpetrated, and the process that needs to be taking place is to ensure redress for the victim and to deter and punish the perpetrator. But in the logic of today, even when we see the killing and the destruction and the abuses, those things have become usual and natural in the occupied Palestinian territories. So are the cries of children. Nobody is listening to them in a flagrant affront to our common values. Mr. President, accountability is of the essence in the occupied Palestinian territories, and this is part and parcel of this Council's mandate, including other mandates. So the necessary resources need to be afforded to the High Commissioner's office to enable it to fulfill that mandate and to ensure that the principle of non-impunity is guaranteed and that we all put an end to the deprivation of the Palestinian people from their rights, freedom, security, and statehood. Thank you, President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Turkey.
Mr. President, Israel has been implementing a denial policy against Palestine, Palestinian people, and their inalienable rights for decades. After October 7th, this policy has turned into an unconscionable aggression. Israel has killed 50,000 Palestinians, majority of them women and children. Millions of Palestinians in Gaza were displaced from their homes who faced only rubble upon their return. Palestinians in Gaza are unable to access basic human needs, clean water, healthcare and shelter. Humanitarian aid must be provided unhindered. Those who commit crimes must be held accountable before the law. Turkey has submitted its declaration of intervention before the ICJ. Mr. President, the current ceasefire must be made permanent. International community should insist that Israel walk the path of peace. The Israeli occupation of the West Bank is expanding. The recent attacks of Israeli forces to 3 refugee camps have led to forced displacement of nearly 40,000 Palestinians. There are extremist groups in Israel calling for the annexation of the West Bank. The international community should oppose firmly Israel's occupation attempts and aggression. For the sake of peace in the region, the establishment of a sovereign, independent and contiguous Palestinian state based on pre-1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital should no longer be delayed. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Australia.
Thank you, President. Australia welcomes a ceasefire in Gaza after 15 months of conflict and a devastating loss of civilian life. We urge all parties to respect the agreement's terms and for all phases of the deal to be implemented in full to safeguard a lasting peace and ensure respect for the human rights of all. Civilians must be protected, including the humanitarian workers and medical workers essential to life-saving care, and hostages released immediately. Australia hopes the ceasefire offers an opportunity for the Palestinian people to rebuild, reform their governance and pursue self-determination. We repeat our unequivocal condemnation of Hamas and its terrorist actions. There can be no role for Hamas in the future governance of Gaza. We are deeply concerned by increased violence in the West Bank, including the actions of Palestinian militant groups and ongoing acts of settler violence. We call on Israeli and Palestinian authorities to hold perpetrators to account and ensure civilians are protected during security operations. Australia's long-standing position is that Israeli settlements in the West Bank are illegal under international law and a significant obstacle to peace. We call on Israel to cease settlement activity. Australia is committed to working with the international community towards a two-state solution, a Palestinian state and the State of Israel, living side by side in peace and security with the human rights of all respected. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Maldives.
Mr. President, today we gather once again as the voices of the Palestinian people continue to be blatantly ignored. Since the ceasefire agreement on January 19, Israel has issued tenders for the construction of nearly 1,000 additional settler homes in the occupied West Bank, adding to the 100 existing settlements that already house 500,000 illegal settlers. With approximately 1.9 million people internally displaced in Gaza, children remain the most vulnerable victims of this relentless conflict, enduring violence, hunger, disease, and inadequate shelter, all exacerbated by harsh winter conditions. The death toll of children is now more than 13,300. As the Secretary General warned, what will remain is a generation left homeless and traumatized. Israel's continued aggression is a direct result of the impunity it has enjoyed despite repeated violations of international law. We urge the international community to hold Israel accountable and put an end to this culture of impunity. The Maldives rejects any attempt to displace the population of Gaza, ending the unlawful occupation of Palestinian lands, and a blatant violation of their inalienable human rights is not just a moral imperative, but a necessity for peace and justice.
We reaffirm our call for the establishment of an independent and sovereign state of Palestine based on the pre-1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Norway.
President, we thank the High Commissioner for his continued reporting. We share the concern over the drastic worsening of the human rights situation in Palestine. It is paramount that all parties now respect the ceasefire agreement in Gaza and follow through on the various elements in all three phases. All hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally. Humanitarian access must be safe and unhindered into and within all parts of Gaza. The coming months will be critical. Gaza is a part of Palestine and must be governed and rebuilt by the Palestinians under one unified and legitimate Palestinian government. We must support the Palestinian government in this endeavor. We must also prevent any forcible transfer of Palestinians within or from Gaza. The acceleration of illegal settlement activity, settler violence, and the rapid expansion of Israeli military operations in the West Bank are also deeply concerning. Civilians must be protected. Freedom of movement must be respected. It is imperative that there is a clear path towards a two-state solution based on internationally recognized borders and international law, including the right to self-determination. This is why Norway, together with Saudi Arabia and the European Union, has taken a leading role in the Global Alliance for the implementation of the two-state solution. High Commissioner, what is your assessment of the implementation of the UNRWA legislation adopted by the Knesset, and how will this affect your priorities ahead? I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Portugal.
Portugal welcomes the High Commissioner's report and expresses its deep concern with its findings on the alarming deterioration of the situation in the OPT. Portugal strongly condemns the unjustified terrorist attacks of October 7, including the taking of hostages and acts of sexual violence. Portugal deplores the unacceptable number of civilian casualties resulting from the military operations by Israel in Gaza, which have led to an unprecedented level of destruction and to the collective punishment of civilians. We welcome the ceasefire agreement and call for its full and timely implementation, allowing for an end to hostilities, the release of all hostages, and the impeded access of humanitarian aid to Gaza. We recall the irreplaceable role and unique mandate of UNRWA and call for the withdrawal of legislation hindering its operations. As regards the West Bank, Portugal condemns the expansion of Israeli settlements, which are illegal under international law, and remains concerned about the increase of violence by extremist settlers who must be held accountable. Political solution remains the only way forward to a just and lasting peace based on the two-state solution. Therefore, Portugal opposes all actions that undermine its viability, including the forced displacement of Palestinians. We call for the accountability and justice for the grave human rights violations committed for the respect.
I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Iraq.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. يقدر العراق الجهود التي يبذلها.
Thank you very much, President. We commend the efforts of the High Commission on Human Rights to shed light on the crimes of the occupying power committed against the defenseless Palestinian people. We call on him and Bureau members to continue efforts to shed light on the brutality of crimes and the sheer extent of the suffering of the Palestinian people. The humanitarian situation in the occupied Palestinian territory is serious. The genocidal war and persecutions continue, particularly in Gaza, and we categorically condemn the war crimes, genocidal crimes perpetrated by the genocidal power, and ask for accountability for the perpetrators of these abject crimes and compensation for the victims. Iraq President rejects the calls for the transfer of Palestinians from their land, especially the Gaza Strip. This runs counter to international law. We call for better access of urgent humanitarian aid, and we believe UNRWA should be allowed to continue to support the Palestinian people. We ask for Israel to shoulder its legal and moral responsibility and to allow the Palestinian people. The speaker is interrupted.
Mr. High Commissioner, Slovenia shares the urgent concerns outlined in your report. We echo your call for accountability and justice as fundamental pillars to end cycles of violence and impunity. The findings of the report, high civilian casualties, the use of force, home demolitions, repeated mass displacements, show the flagrant violations of international law, including human rights law and international humanitarian law, which erode prospects for peace. UN Secretary General reminded us recently at this Council of the importance of human rights through peace and peace through human rights. Civilians, especially children and women, must endure disproportionate suffering for far too long. We call for urgent protection of all civilians and demand accountability for violations of international humanitarian law and human rights violations, including for grave violations against children and sexual and gender-based violence. We must act decisively by demanding compliance with international legal obligations, including UN Security Council resolutions, supporting impartial monitoring and ensuring aid reaches those in need. Slovenia remains steadfast in its commitment to human rights, justice, and a future where Palestinians and Israelis coexist in peace, security, and dignity. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Spain.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, President. The position of Spain is reflected in the statement made by the European Union. In 2002, in this very room, which has not yet been renewed, I chaired a meeting about the situation in Jenin. The city was destroyed as a result of the defensive shield process by Israel, which caused so very many deaths. And that operation served nothing. And all these years afterwards, we're seeing a new cycle of violence, as so eloquently described by the High Commissioner in his report. And I'm not going to go over the horrifying figures in that report, but we are asking the parties, first of all, that they comply with the ceasefire. Secondly, that they allow UNRWA to carry out their absolutely essential humanitarian work for people who are suffering in conditions of hunger and cold that beg a belief. And thirdly, there is a solution which requires a two-state solution. Let's just put an end to this madness. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Indonesia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Indonesia reaffirms our unwavering solidarity with the Palestinian people. Their suffering has lasted for far too long, with each generation scarred by the occupying powers' blatant disregard for human rights and humanitarian obligation. We are deeply appalled by the mounting verified reports of grave violations amounting to war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by Israel. Striking schools and hospitals is indefensible. Forcing 90% of Gaza population into displacement is unacceptable. An estimated 64,000 Palestinian deaths cannot be ignored. Mr. President, Indonesia rejects any attempt to forcibly displace Palestinians or alter the OPT's demographic. Such action block the realization of an independent and sovereign Palestinian state under the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. We also denounce Israel legislation targeting UNRWA. The occupying power cannot ignore its duty to ensure and facilitate aid. Indonesia demands swift action to ensure Israel complies with the ICJ's order, prevent genocide, cease attacks on civilians, and allow displaced Palestinians to return home safely and with dignity. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. The DPRK delegation deeply concerns about the recent development in the Gaza Strip, causing widespread public outrage and concern as Israel is openly committing genocidal acts, ethnic cleansing, and annexation under active U.S. patronage. The Gaza Strip and the West Bank are the inherent territory of the Palestinian people, as is clearly stipulated in the UN resolutions. Instead of delivering protection and humanitarian aid for the suffering Palestinians, Israel is brutally killing and forcibly displacing numerous civilians. It is a heinous crime against humanity that deprives the Palestinian people of their rights to existence and development. We oppose and reject in the strongest terms all sorts of attempts to deny the Palestinian people's rights to existence and development. We express our invariable support to and solidarity with Palestinian people in their struggle to establish an independent state with the East Quds as its capital, and with Arab nations in their just efforts to seek a fair settlement of the question of Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Vanuatu.
Thank you, Mr. President, and we thank the High Commissioner for his report. Vanuatu welcomes the Gaza ceasefire hostage and prisoner release deal, which brings hope for millions of people whose lives have been ravaged by the conflict. Despite this, Vanuatu is gravely concerned about the crisis in the occupied Palestinian territories, the civilian deaths, and the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza, as well as in Israel, perpetrated by all parties. We join your plea for all human rights to be respected. We call for rapid, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian relief to be provided to all civilians. There is an urgent need to maintain hospital and other medical services and public health with special regard for the health requirements of women, girls, and the vulnerable population. And we call for the effective implementation of the ceasefire in Gaza and call for the special regards of health, women, and vulnerable populations. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Arab Emirates.
President, we have taken good note of the High Commissioner's report on the human rights situation of the OPT, and we express our concerns as to the human rights violations and Israeli policies and practices which run counter to international law and international humanitarian law in the occupied Palestinian territory. A ceasefire is a good starting point, and the parties must respect the conditions. We welcome the efforts of Qatar, Egypt, and the United States in order to reach such an agreement. We categorically reject any attempt to try and displace the Palestinian people from their land and call for reconstruction in Gaza based on an inclusive and lasting peace inspired by a two-state solution. It is necessary to avoid the conflict spilling over into the region. We reiterate our position in support of the brother people of the Palestinians and a two-state solution to create a Palestinian state which is sovereign with East Jerusalem as its capital in order to comply with international law. Thank you.
Floor to the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Mr. President, the Islamic Republic of Iran takes note of the Commissioner's report, which confirms that Israel has launched massive military attacks on residential areas, hospitals, and schools in blatant violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. We are also gravely concerned by the report's finding on the forced displacement of approximately 90% of Gaza's population, many displaced multiple times, in clear violation of Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. This systematic destruction and forced expulsion amount to acts intended to destroy the Palestinian group, meeting the legal definition of genocide. Furthermore, we express outrage over unlawful killings in West Bank, constituting a flagrant breach of Article 147 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Iran concludes that these actions by Israel amount to war crimes and bear the hallmarks of genocide. We reject any language equating the perpetrators of genocide with resistance groups fighting occupation, and we will spare no effort in supporting all measures to liberate Palestine from the grip of this regime. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa.
Mr. President, South Africa aligns with the African Group. We are deeply concerned about the human tragedy in the OPT resulting from Israel's onslaught on Gaza, together with its ongoing siege of the West Bank. The litany of unspeakable horrors perpetrated against the Palestinians is unprecedented. As such, Gaza is in ruins, strewn with the blood of the innocent, where those who have managed to survive cling to a life of deprivation. South Africa therefore welcomes the ceasefire. However, it must be resolutely implemented. In so doing, UNRWA must be protected, as Israel's ban on its activities undermines the ceasefire and disrupts Gaza's recovery and reconstruction efforts. As part of this process, any initiative that seeks to forcibly displace the Palestinians from their homeland cannot be countenanced, as it amounts to ethnic cleansing. Indeed, unless and until we ensure an end to Israel's unlawful occupation, the suffering of the Palestinians will continue. As a Council, we therefore have a legal and moral obligation to ensure that Israel is held accountable, as it is the impunity accorded to Israel which lies at the core of its genocidal actions today. It is for this reason that, as part of the recently formed The Hague Group, South Africa committed to taking effective measures to support the realization of the Palestinian right to self-determination, and we invite all states to join us. Much like the international community stood united against apartheid, we now need to display the very same enduring solidarity with the Palestinians. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Chile.
Señor President, we wish to thank the High Commissioner for his report. We regret that once again, Israel has denied its cooperation so that the High Commissioner's team could visit on the ground, and this is detrimental to the human rights in the region. We also regret that they're not here today in order to respond to this report. Chile has always insisted on the Palestinian people's requirement for a two-state population. We reject the forced transfer of people from Gaza because this would be a severe violation of international law, and it would prevent Palestinians from having their own state. Any forced transfer of population is considered a war crime, and in certain circumstances is a crime against humanity. Forced displacement has also been described as part of ethnic cleansing. President Chile has always supported the fact that Israeli settlements in Gaza are illegal, and we also condemn the fact that humanitarian aid has not been allowed to enter, which fosters the illegal occupation. We believe that there must be compliance with the ICJ's conclusions, and measures must be taken to put an end as soon as possible to illegal settlements. Thank you.
The Kingdom of the Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the EU statement and expresses its high appreciation for the tireless work of the High Commissioner and his team, and welcomes the report. The report represents a grim reality of the past year, following the heinous attack of Hamas on Israel on October 7, 2023, the capture of hostages, and the war that unfolded afterwards. The suffering of civilians on both sides, especially women and children, and the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza is heartbreaking. The Netherlands calls on all parties to comply with international law, in particular international humanitarian law. Although the report paints a bleak picture, we continue to strive for peace, justice, and accountability. To guarantee and continue documentation and monitoring of human rights violations, we call on all parties to cooperate with OHHR and grant access to the area. The Netherlands will contribute an additional €1 million to the OHHR in the Palestinian territories. Additionally, to guarantee the safety of journalists, an additional financial contribution to Free Press Unlimited will be made. The report demonstrates once again that a negotiated and sustainable two-state solution is needed now. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Egypt.
السيد الرئيس يشعر وفد مصر بقلق بالغ إزاء ما
President, we have considered the report of the High Commissioner and believe there have been human rights violations against the Palestinian people for more than a year. Egypt supports the right of the Palestinian people to life and to defend their cause. The Egyptian position supporting the Palestinian cause is unshaken, and we call on the international community to shoulder its responsibility and implement its three-phase ceasefire. The Palestinian people have an inalienable right to self-determination, and there must be a recognition of the legitimacy of establishing an independent Palestinian state. There can be no attempt to strip the Palestinian people of their land or transferring them from their historic territories. We must consider the fact that there has to be an end to the Israeli occupation, and we call on the High Commissioner to ensure the Palestinian people's right to self-determination. Thank you.
I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malaysia.
Mr. President, we thank the High Commissioner for his report, which once again exposes the systemic violations of international law perpetrated by Israel. Israel's illegal occupation in the OPT has led to decades of apartheid policies and gross human rights violations. The crisis in Gaza has resulted in nearly 50,000 casualties, with over 2.3 million others being displaced and suffering from inhumane conditions. Impunity must end, and Israel must be held fully accountable for its atrocities. The international community must exert pressure on Israel and work together to ensure that all international obligations are fully implemented, including the rulings of the ICJ and the findings of the Commission of the Inquiry. Malaysia calls on all parties involved to fully implement the multi-phase ceasefire and hostage release agreement that came into effect on 19 January. This agreement is merely a starting point, and the root causes of this conflict must be addressed. We strongly oppose any plans to forcibly displace Palestinians from their homeland. Resettling Palestinians away from Gaza amounts to ethnic cleansing and is a clear violation of international law. Malaysia reiterates its commitment to the Palestinian cause and will continue supporting the establishment of an independent and sovereign state of Palestine based on the pre-1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital, as well as the admission of Palestine as a full member of the United Nations. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Algeria.
Thank you, President. My delegation wishes to thank the High Commissioner for Human Rights for his report, and we emphasize that these attempts to put on an equal footing the occupying power and the Palestinians when it comes to their responsibilities is not a healthy approach, and it runs counter to international law. There's also the consideration of the ICJ ruling and the fact that there's been no cooperation with the High Commissioner in order to investigate crimes. We believe that there has been systematic murder and forced displacement, and these constitute crimes against humanity, unprecedented crimes. Algeria reiterated its support for Palestinians' right to self-determination and to an independent state. And we call for the return of Gazan inhabitants to their homes. There must be humanitarian aid entering the territory. We would call on UN agencies and states to ensure accountability for the crimes committed by the occupying power.
Thank you. Mr. High Commissioner, we appreciate your timely report. Maintaining the ceasefire in Gaza is essential to achieve peace in the Middle East. We urge all parties to engage in negotiations in good faith to ensure the freedom of all hostages, unimpeded access to humanitarian assistance, and the permanent cessation of hostilities. The human rights and humanitarian situation in the OPT remains highly alarming. not only in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. We express our strong concern with the intensification in recent weeks of Israeli military operations in refugee camps in the north of the West Bank. The reconstruction of devastated Gaza must respect international human rights law, avoiding additional unlawful forced displacement of Palestinians. All human rights violations in the OPT by Israel must be investigated, and those responsible must be held accountable. We're also concerned with Israeli legislation that aims at hindering the activities of UNRWA in the OPT. We recall the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, pointing to the illegality of the continued Israeli presence in the OPT. I thank you.
Merci. Ceci est...
Thank you. This was the last statement that we could accommodate this evening. We shall meet again tomorrow at 10 in order to continue this dialogue, to be followed by the enhanced interactive dialogue on the human rights situation in Eritrea. Dear colleagues, before concluding, I would like to remind everybody that tomorrow we will mark the National Day of Traditional Dress. So I encourage everybody to come in their finest traditional attire in order to pay tribute to our diversity and to celebrate together all that unites us. I now close the 7th meeting of the 58th session of the Human Rights Council and wish you a pleasant evening.